Dylan William was born and educated in Wales. A keen sportsman and musician, he taught for 8 years in London schools and then went into university research. He's now Deputy Director of the Institute of Education in London. Dylan, one of the interesting things when you read your background was the fact that you were born and brought up in Welsh-speaking Wales and didn't actually speak English until the age of 9.
Well, of course, when I went to school, I was speaking Welsh and everybody around me was speaking Welsh. All my friends were Welsh. I didn't really have much need of English. At that time, there were quite a few Welsh language primary schools in South Wales, but there weren't any Welsh medium secondary schools within easily travelling distance. So my parents decided that I needed to go to the local grammar school, and to do that I'd have to take the 11 plus, and to do that I'd have to go to an English medium primary school for the last year of junior school.
You did finish school successfully, you did go to university, you got a degree, but you're also a semi-professional musician at the time, so
yes.
Yeah, was that a strong motivational force during those secondary school years?
Yes, I mean, I was very interested in music. I made my own guitar. I wasn't quite as good as Brian May at that, I have to say. It was a monster of a thing. But I was very interested in playing in a group.
Did you want to make that your career? Do you regret that you're not a famous musician rather than a famous educationist?
I don't regret it at all. I did actually go to university, and I played with a band all the way through university, and I eventually moved to London in order to work with a group. And I started teaching just to get money together to buy a public address system for the band.
I was going to ask you about that because, you know, as I said in the introduction, you were a teacher, and indeed you were a teacher of maths. You almost slipped into it.
I was very fortunate to end up in one of the toughest schools in London. And I say that because I started work on Monday morning at the same time as an economics teacher who lasted until morning break, walked off site and was never seen again. But it was one of those schools that everybody was struggling. All the teachers were struggling, and therefore there was a huge amount of support. And that's the only reason I think I survived, was because
you didn't feel as though you weren't coping and everyone else was.
Everybody was struggling, and everybody was open about that and talking to each other and talking about how they were dealing with it, strategies they were trying. And that was a tremendously supportive environment in that school in Ilya.
When did you make the decision you weren't going to become a professional musician and you were going to pursue a career in education?
I'd been teaching about 3 years by that point. It wasn't a difficult decision at all, and it's not one I've ever regretted. It's, you know, teaching has just been such a hugely challenging, rewarding, and just intellectually demanding job. And I've had huge support from the colleagues that I've worked with, that it's not a decision I've ever regretted.
And when you look at how you then left school and went into educational research, there's a very strong link, because you were invited, or you ended up doing some research in maths, so it was very much to begin with research that came out of the subject that you were teaching in school. Absolutely. Was it then that you thought, I quite like this, I think I'll pursue the research? I mean, how did you move from classroom teaching to full-time research?
Well, I had been working with a research project looking at graded assessment, so I was really interested in, even back in the 1980s, early 1980s, I was really interested in the role that assessment could play in improving what we did with students.
This is before key stage tests, of course.
Before any of that. It was just about using assessments to make your teaching better adapted to children's strengths and weaknesses. And I was involved with this project, and a job came up, basically. And they offered me a fixed-term research fellowship. And I just thought it was too good a chance to pass up, so I just accepted it. And people were very skeptical. They said, "Are you giving up a safe job in teaching for a fixed-term research fellowship?"
You've lived a life a bit like that, though, hadn't you? You'd sort of taken these risks.
But I've never actually ever planned my career, because I started working as this research fellow. I was appointed to a permanent lectureship a couple of years later. And you could say the biggest break I got in my career was when I was asked to coordinate the development of the Key Stage 3 assessment tasks for the national curriculum in 1989. And I think the reason I got that job was because I was the only person who could speak Welsh.
Right.
And it was necessary for the consortium we were working with to deliver assessments in English and in Welsh.
Let's look at your research now. We talk a lot about what makes a good teacher, and it's the sort of thing that people think they know instinctively because everybody's been to school. But from your evidence, what do you think makes a good teacher?
Well, I'm still struggling with that question. One of the things we know is that teachers make a huge difference. So we know that the best teachers get far more performance or progress out of students on any measure, whether it's a test or just whether students like the subject, than the least successful teachers. So we know that teachers make a huge difference. About 4 times as much as schools make a difference. But it's incredibly elusive pinning it down. So it's certainly not subject qualification. Teachers with more qualifications don't appear to produce any more value.
Like if you've got a first-class degree, it doesn't make you
doesn't
best
seem to make any
teachers than
difference.
with a third.
Masters, postgraduate qualifications don't seem to make any difference. Even the amount of subject knowledge you have seems to be very weakly correlated with student progress. So in a way, my intellectual work has been about trying to pin down what is the difference between the best and the least successful teachers. And I think it's to do with the way that they teach. I think that what I do is, I don't lead anything. What I do is I follow behind the most successful practitioners
and observe.
and try to make sense of what it is that they do really well, and then try to find ways of sharing that with other people so that they can actually pick up some ideas about it.
How much of that is replicable? Because the way you describe it sounds almost as though it's something about the teacher's personality or their ability to communicate.
It's
So,
not, no.
you know, how do we give all teachers the skills which you think are needed to be a good teacher?
For me, it's about helping teachers find ways of constantly examining their practice, of rejuvenating themselves professionally, so that their work is stimulating intellectually, as well as the emotionally challenging and draining job that we know it is.
Can we just talk a bit about good teachers and good schools? Because it's a phrase that's used a lot. Now, if you believe, as you do and as I do as well, that it's the quality of teaching that makes a difference, how do you explain this phenomenon, really, that what the nation calls good schools tend to be those that teach middle-class children? I mean, it can't be that naturally good teachers gravitate to teach the middle class.
No, some children arrive at school with all the cultural and social resources that are needed to survive, even with bad teaching. You could actually say that
Bad teachers can get good results.
bad teachers can get good results. And in fact, being middle class confers a kind of immunity against bad teaching.
Yeah.
So that if it's poor quality teaching, middle class kids can often make sense of that.
Can
and
good
so-
teachers get poor results?
Yes, they can. They can get suboptimal results. But the challenge for us is how we get good teachers into all schools, because the evidence that we've got shows that if you get teachers in the top 25% of quality, then you don't get achievement gaps. They never arise. The problem is the achievement gaps we see now by the time the children are 16 is the accumulation of very, very small differences that have accumulated over 10 years.
Yes.
So those children are falling a little bit behind every year. And by the time they're 16, it's a big gap.
It's a big gap, because that's what we know from the test results, that the social class gap is there at 5, but it widens
Exactly.
as you go through school. Are you saying that if we could get the quality of teaching so that all teachers teach in the way that the top 25% teaching at the moment, we could even break that link?
Absolutely. The research by American academics has shown conclusively that in reception and year 1 classes, you don't get any achievement gaps when they're taught by good teachers. But when they're taught by average and below average teachers, those achievement gaps begin to appear.
Do you think it matters whether poor children are educated in, I suppose, socially segregated schools? So you've got poor children in one school and middle-class children in another. Is there anything about the social mix of the pupils that makes it easier for teachers to raise standards? Because this is another
Absolutely.
supposed answer to this question.
I mean, I try not to talk about poverty because I have no evidence that poverty makes a difference, because I don't have an explanatory mechanism. What I do know is that children from middle-class homes have cultural and social resources that they've acquired from home that allows them to succeed. And a lot of children from working-class homes don't arrive at school with those resources. But the problem is that when we segregate children, whether you segregate within schools by streaming or setting, or segregate between schools with grammar schools, you deny the lowest achieving students the opportunities to learn from the highest achievers. And that's why it's no coincidence that all the countries that do really well in the international league tables, they're the ones with the inclusive education systems.
You're talking about academically inclusive, because you could have socially segregated schools that are still academically inclusive. You just got the range of ability in a particular social class.
Yes.
Is that a fair comment?
Yes, that's absolutely fair. But as I said, for me, it's about having more inclusive schools where students are there learning from each other and contributing to each other's education. The problem with that, some people think that you're holding back the most able
Yes.
students.
Yes.
But the work that's been done in the United States shows that often it's the children who give help to others who benefit
Yes,
most.
the cooperative learning model.
Yeah, and every teacher I've ever spoken to has said that they never really understood their subject until they had to teach it. And one of the things you do by encouraging peer learning is you force particularly the boys, you force them to become more reflective, and then they deepen their own understanding, and their long-term retention of ideas is actually increased because they're being forced to think about things in different ways from the way that they would normally choose to think about them.
What does that say about the myriad of initiatives we've seen in recent years, academies, special schools, changing governance arrangements, all the things that I suppose get adjusted, amended in the hope that it's I think as you said, that the silver bullet that will solve our problems. Does it contribute at all, or is it all a waste of time and money?
I think it's probably a waste of time and money, but not because it doesn't make any difference at all, but because it makes a small difference, and it distracts attention away from the big issues. What we're beginning to understand is that what really matters is what happens day in, day out in the classroom. And anything that you do outside the classroom is only relevant insofar as it helps teachers do a better job day in, day out in the classroom. So freeing teachers up might make a difference. Giving them more money certainly makes a difference. But
Because?
Well, because you can have smaller classes.
I thought you meant paying them more.
Yeah, well,
than more money into
but that
education.
would also help.
Yeah.
It doesn't really matter. I mean, more resources does produce higher achievement. But the question is whether we're spending the money in the right way.
Yes.
So, for example, we could reduce class size. But the
Yes.
trouble with reducing class size is you need more teachers. And the teachers you'll bring in won't be as good as the teachers you've already got. And if teacher quality is so important as the research suggests it is, then the teachers you're bringing in, because you've got bigger, smaller class sizes, will be a lot less good than the ones you've already got. And so you will actually lower achievement standards by bringing in, by reducing class size.
Of the sort of national and international league tables that we've got and the ways of measuring progress, which ones are reliable?
Well, none of them are perfectly reliable and none of them are perfectly valid, but the problems in each of them are probably not great enough for us to be able to say that our kids are at least as good as those in Japan. I think the evidence from the research is very clear. What we need to do is sustained investment in teachers' professional development. And that's politically difficult because it's a slow process. It's not an easy policy lever for politicians to pull. It's not something they can actually say, look, we've done this, we've created this. But it's the one that the evidence shows works. The problem is that we've never really done professional development properly.
I was going to come on to that. If the important thing is the quality of teaching, the really big questions become, are we training teachers effectively, and do we support their ongoing training effectively? Is it good enough for the tasks they need to do?
I think it is. I think by and large, teacher training is pretty fit for purpose. I would actually have them spending probably a little bit less time in schools.
And more time on reflection.
And more time on reflection, because I think that the really intensive programs we have at the moment really push teachers into coping strategies too early in their career. And because we need a lot of schools to get the placements, we don't have enough variety and enough difference in the experience of each student. So, but I mean, I don't think there's very much wrong with our models. I think we should experiment a little more. I'd be quite interested in models that look at, for example, giving a teacher a 3-month survival course, just basics, and then in at the deep end.
That's right.
And then take them out for
And
6
reflect
months
them.
after a couple of years.
A bit like Teach First.
Yes.
That's quite a different model, isn't it?
Quite a
in
different
terms
model. I mean, I think most of the theory in teacher education is irrelevant until you've got some practice to make sense of it with. And so I think that we need intensive periods of exposure to practice, but I think then you need time for systematic, reflective time to make sense of it all.
If we're better at initial teacher training than we used to be, are we yet good enough at continuous professional development right the way through the career?
Well, no, I think that's where we've really fallen down. There hasn't been any sustained attention to what are you doing day in, day out to make teachers better. And I don't think the kinds of contributions that universities have made have filled that gap either. What we need is ways to help teachers get better at the craft of classroom practice.
But we do, I mean, you're a researcher, we do find new things out from research which somehow we've got to enable teachers to become familiar with. There's an updating in that sense that their professional development should be different in the light of what research tells us is best practice?
I'm not sure about that, actually. I think that the best teachers today are no better than the best teachers of 100 years ago. I think the difference is we have evidence about why they're better and how they're better. But it seems to me that the perfectibility of teaching is an illusion. We don't talk about modern composers being better than Mozart. We don't talk about artists being better than Rembrandt. I don't think teaching is of that kind of thing. I mean, I think the challenge for us, particularly in the education profession, is maintaining the quality of teaching when, in fact, women, for example, who for many years were denied career opportunities outside the education profession, came into teaching, and therefore we had an extraordinarily good teaching profession, often with women who were denied other opportunities.
But they're choosing other things.
And now they're choosing other things. So maintaining the quality of the teaching force in the face of those widening opportunities is actually a huge challenge. So for me, it's not about a professional updating, it's helping every teacher become a lifelong learner and a lifelong perfecter of that craft. And you know, as I said, well, maybe perfecting is actually the wrong word. It's because you never perfect your practice. It's, you know, no matter how long you've been doing it. You know, I work with teachers, you know, regularly, and all the time I'm trying to think about ways in which I can be more successful as a practitioner.
You've got a much more serious and ongoing approach to teachers and how they should be assessing their pupils and how important that is. So just take us through sort of the main points of that.
Well, my experience in America has convinced me that we need some kind of assessment at the end of learning. If you look at the American model, you have what I call the banking model of assessment. A student does a piece of work and the teacher marks it, and if it gets an A, the student gets to keep the A even if they subsequently forget everything they ever knew about that topic. And so what that encourages is a kind of very shallow approach to the curriculum, where teachers and students skate across the surface, and everybody feels good because everybody gets 100%. But students don't actually accumulate any knowledge. Now, at the other extreme, you have our system or the Japanese system, where everything is on, you know, one hot day in July. And I think that's equally inappropriate. But I do think that we need some kind of assessments at the end of learning to require students to build up and to accumulate knowledge and to synthesize it.
When you talk about end of learning, you're talking about packages of learning.
Yes, yes.
So a package lasting?
Well, it could be anything from a year to 2, 3, 4 years.
Yes, and that needs to be formal, it needs to have an outcome, it needs to be recognisable as a qualification that can be compared to other people's performance.
And it needs to be authenticated. It needs to be the student's own work rather than the work of brothers and sisters, so you need control conditions. So I think that a lot of our policy with regard to the high stakes assessments are actually quite sensible. The problem is that we've actually tended to dumb down our assessments. So for example, our science tests now, most of the marks are single, 0-1 questions. It's mostly focusing on knowledge. So I think we need to think very carefully about having tests worth teaching to. Because the genie's out of the bottle.
There's nothing wrong in teaching to test if the test means that a student's improved, is there?
Absolutely. So what we need to do is to make sure that teaching to the test is a worthwhile activity that actually encourages the kinds of things we need students to be able to do.
You sound as though you're making an argument for even more assessment when most people are making an argument at the moment that we've got too much assessment.
Well, I think we need slightly different kinds of assessments. So we need more assessment during learning, but also different kinds of assessments at the end. We also need very clear public interest statements about the accuracy and reliability of the assessment. So one of the things I've been very critical of is not that the tests are bad, but that the tests are limited, that they have a limited reliability, and we need people to understand what this means. A student gets a grade D, but they might on a different occasion have got a grade C. So you shouldn't actually assume that because they've got a grade D that they're not up to something.
So it's not the assessment that's the pressure, it's what we do with the assessment and the way we perceive them.
We overinterpret our results, and the government has continually failed to produce any evidence that would allow people to understand the reliability of the technology, if you like. And that's why I'm critical of much government policy. We need clear health warnings about the accuracy of our assessments. Otherwise, parents can't make sensible decisions, students can't make sensible decisions.
It becomes difficult, that, doesn't it? Especially with the media, that let's say the 11-year-old tests are meant to be as a snapshot of our 11-year-olds right across the nation. And you can see, for policy purpose, why that might be interesting or useful. And to tell you the truth, you don't need it to be exact, you just need it to be reliable, and the two things are not the same. But with the performance of that and parents using that to choose secondary schools, it's the public use of the statistics that I'm not sure anyone can control. Once you've got that national testing, doesn't it inevitably become a bigger animal than you intended it to be?
It does, if you do it in the way that we do it. But
So go on, so what? So not publish them? I mean, what's
or,
the answer?
or just publish value-added measures. If we could actually give parents accurate information about how much their child is likely to learn if they're at that particular school through a contextual value-added measure, then we would be giving them better advice than this misleading advice about the raw results obtained by children, which may not bear any relation to how your child might do at that school. And that just provides the backdrop to what's really important, which is the student learning.
Yeah.
And I think what Paul Black and I have been trying to do in our work over the last 15, 20 years has been to understand how assessment, not at the end of learning, but minute by minute and day by day, can actually be used to help teachers do a better job of their teaching.
They need to be taught about that, don't they? It's not the instinctive assessment that every teacher makes. It's something more scientific than that.
It's more rigorous, it's more scientific, and it's better distributed. You know, at the moment, most teachers make decisions about whether they move on in their teaching just by looking at how glazed the eyes are.
Yeah, time to move on.
Time to move on, rather than actually having ways of asking questions that are very carefully crafted, that are designed to catch out important misconceptions, and getting us an answer from every single student in the class, rather than just one or two who put their hand up.
Is there anything wrong with the way we use data to compare school with school? I mean, you've said that we've got good schools and bad schools, and that teacher performance in schools differs, and people have a right to know that. And you know, league tables is one way of comparing school performance with school performance. Is there anything wrong with that?
Provided you're comparing like with like. The trouble is that many of our schools that appear to head our league tables have only one core competence, and that's attracting smart, high-achieving middle-class kids. And so a parent who relies on that information as an index of the quality of the of education being provided by that school will be misled. So what I'm pushing for is data that really helps parents, better information that really helps parents understand how good an education that school is offering.
What do you think the explanation is for the research evidence we've seen over the last few weeks, which shows that as a school system that we performed less well internationally in both the PISA studies and the Pearl studies?
What almost every implementation of high-stakes assessments has found is that the clearer you are about what you want, the more likely you are to get it, but the less likely it is to mean anything. So what we've seen is teachers getting better and better at preparing our kids for our national curriculum tests, and the scores on those are going up. They've been doing that by neglecting the things they used to teach that are tested in things like the
Whole book reading.
Yes, the Pearls and the TIMS and the PISA results, and those scores are going down. So we have this strange situation where some scores are going up and some scores are going down. Now, whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing depends on what you think is good learning.
But you take the headline, don't you? You don't look at what it was actually testing,
Right.
and that's part of the problem, isn't it?
But our kids are getting better and better at a smaller and narrower range of things. And my worry is that we cannot predict the world that our young people will enter, either as consumers, as citizens, or as employees. And therefore, my worry is that we're pushing them to become more and more expert at the 19th century skills, and we're not developing the skills. And I think Seymour Papert said it best. He said there's only one 21st century skill, and that is the ability to act intelligently when you're faced with something that you've never seen before.
Yeah, that ability to change, to master change.
That ability to think and to be smart in the face of new situations. And my worry is that we're actually encouraging the wrong kinds of focus in our schools by these narrow, content-driven, rote recall tests.
Let's move on and talk a little bit about the relationship of research and politics.
Yeah.
You know, how government takes note of research. I mean, you're a leading researcher in one of the country's leading educational establishments. What access do you get to government so that you can talk to them in the way that you've talked to me and tell them what the research findings are?
I think that there's need on both sides to actually understand the agenda of the other. So I think that education researchers in the past haven't done a very good job of understanding the political complexities of life in policy making, and nor, on the other hand, have policymakers understood what educational research has to offer. But I think that we're actually learning from each other. I think it's far more open than it's ever been.
Yeah.
And I think we have a real shot at actually driving policy in an evidence-informed way.
We're still, in some ways, a nation that, you know, if you read the press, talks about a failing education system, no progress made, you know, bottom of the league tables. And yet you've talked in a very exciting and optimistic way about what's happening and what's possible.
Yes.
You've been in education for a decade or two now, or more. Looking back, what's your take on how well we're doing? Are we better than we used to be, or are we as good as we could be?
The problem with teaching is that every situation the teacher faces is so complex that you have to develop this ability to react intelligently, using wisdom, using developed judgment, using intuition. And that's why I think that we're making real strides at the moment, because we're beginning to understand the complexity of what teachers do day in, day out, and we're beginning to understand how important it is that we support that practice rather than try to tell them what they're doing wrong and tell them to do it in a different way, because that never works. It just doesn't work. But I think we're seeing a much better synthesis between research and practice. We're seeing a much better synthesis between research and policy making. And I'm actually more optimistic about the possibilities of transformation at scale than I have ever been in my entire career, either as a teacher or as a professional developer. We're beginning to put things together in the right way, and I think that our students will be the beneficiaries.
Dylan William, thank you very much for being with us today.
You're welcome.